I'm Tucker, and you are in Last Moments. Join me as we uncover the most brutal revenge deaths ever recorded, from a revenge plan targeting a delivery driver's truck to a revenge plotter tampering with a painter's ladder before a high climb in a situation no one saw coming. It was November 3rd, 2017. A rural county road in southern Missouri ran through farmland under cool, clear morning conditions, with dry pavement, light traffic, and gentle curves. Rodney Flocks was 52 years old and worked as a delivery driver. He had been in the profession for over 20 years and was known for his reliability and careful driving habits. He drove an older pickup truck that had been well maintained with no history of mechanical issues. Several months earlier, Rodney had testified in a theft case involving a former co-worker. The former co-worker was identified as Nathan Kells, age 24. He had been convicted largely based on Rodney's testimony. The conviction resulted in job loss and legal penalties. In the weeks following the trial, Nathan sent threatening messages to Rodney, including one stating that Rodney had ruined his life. Nathan had access to the parking area where Rodney stored his truck overnight. Security cameras covered portions of the lot. The truck was parked in an unsecured section used by multiple drivers. Early that morning, Rodney began his usual delivery route. His truck was equipped with a dash cam that recorded continuously. The route included a downhill curve approximately 3 miles from his starting point. As Rodney approached the curve, he applied the brakes. Moments earlier, the dash cam briefly captured the brake warning light illuminating as hydraulic pressure dropped. The footage showed the brake pedal fully depressed, but the truck failed to respond as expected. The partially cut brake line caused progressive hydraulic loss, reducing braking efficiency unevenly, rather than causing total failure. The front brakes retained limited stopping power, but the system degradation left Rodney unable to slow the vehicle enough to navigate the curve safely. He pumped the brakes repeatedly with minimal effect. The truck continued rolling forward at a reduced but uncontrolled speed. He attempted to downshift and use the emergency brake. The vehicle slowed further, but not enough to navigate the curve safely. The truck drifted off the road and into a shallow ditch on the right side. The terrain caused the vehicle to tip, and it rolled twice before coming to rest on its side. Rodney was not wearing his seatbelt. The dashcam captured him being ejected through the driver's side window during the second roll. He struck the ground and did not move. A passing motorist witnessed the rollover and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. Rodney was unresponsive and showed no vital signs. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma sustained during ejection from the vehicle. Investigators examined the truck and discovered that the rear brake line had been partially cut. The cut was clean and deliberate, designed to degrade braking performance gradually. Brake fluid had leaked slowly, reducing hydraulic pressure over time. Authorities reviewed low-light infrared security footage, showing Nathan entering the lot late that night and crouching near Rodney's rear wheel well. During questioning, he denied tampering but could not explain his presence. Forensic analysis later matched tools in his possession to the brake line cut. He was charged with second-degree manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that his actions were deliberate and motivated by revenge. The evidence included the sabotaged brake line, security footage, threatening messages, and forensic tool analysis. The trial concluded with a conviction. Nathan Kells was convicted of second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in the Missouri State Prison. Prosecutors emphasized that the gradual brake failure created a foreseeable risk of serious harm, regardless of whether death was the stated goal. The case closed 10 months after the incident. It was March 22, 2016. When Blake Thornton's reckless disregard for human life finally led to his own violent death on a dark Tennessee highway. The 28-year-old came from a wealthy family whose connections had repeatedly saved him from facing real consequences for his dangerous behavior. Blake worked as a trust fund manager at his family's investment firm. His privileged upbringing had created an arrogant personality that viewed rules as suggestions for lesser people. He treated his multiple DUI arrests as minor inconveniences. Exactly 1 year earlier, Blake had been driving drunk when he struck and killed 6-year-old Emma Lowell in a crosswalk outside her elementary school. The little girl was walking home when Blake's speeding BMW sent her small body flying 30 feet through the air. He fled the scene immediately. Trina Lowell, Emma's 34-year-old mother, watched her only child take her final breath in the hospital that night. The single mother had devoted her entire life to raising Emma. Blake's wealthy family hired expensive lawyers who got him probation, claiming the child had darted into traffic. The injustice consumed Trina completely. She quit her job as a dental hygienist and spent the entire year studying Blake's patterns. She learned he visited Murphy's Tavern every Tuesday night, always leaving around 11:30 p.m. completely intoxicated. His route home took him down Highway 67, a winding mountain road. Trina spent months obsessing over revenge. Online forums and repair manuals taught her how cars worked, and she practiced on junkyard wrecks until her hands moved with mechanical precision. For weeks, Trina followed Blake to Murphy's Tavern parking lot, waiting until he was inside drinking before sliding beneath his silver BMW. She studied every inch of the undercarriage, rehearsing exactly where and how to strike. That fatal Tuesday night, while Blake was inside bragging about beating another DUI charge, Trina made her move. She slipped behind the front wheel well and severed the brake line with one precise cut, deep enough to ensure total failure but hidden well enough to pass a casual glance. At 11:30 p.m., Blake stumbled to his car, completely unaware that his vehicle had just been transformed into a death trap by a grieving mother seeking justice. At mile marker 23, Blake approached the sharp curve where he had previously crashed without consequence. This time, when he pressed the brake pedal, it sank uselessly to the floor. The severed brake line left him with no stopping power, and the BMW carried its full speed straight toward the guardrail at 55 miles per hour. Blake yanked the wheel desperately, but the heavy car barely responded. With no way to slow down, the vehicle plowed through the metal guardrail and became airborne over the 150-foot embankment. For 3 terrifying seconds, Blake experienced the same helplessness his victim had felt. The BMW flipped 3 times down the rocky slope. Blake's body was thrown violently around the interior as windows exploded and the roof collapsed. During the second flip, his neck snapped against the door frame, instantly paralyzing him. Blake remained conscious but unable to move as gasoline leaked from the ruptured fuel tank. Broken glass had shredded his face and arms, while twisted metal pinned his legs. He could smell the gas fumes growing stronger. Blake lay trapped and paralyzed, his broken neck and massive internal injuries stealing his strength within minutes. In those final moments, he finally understood the terror his victim had experienced. He slipped into unconsciousness from blood loss before death claimed him. Trina had been visiting Emma's grave during the crash, establishing a perfect alibi. The investigation initially ruled it another drunk driving accident. However, forensic analysis eventually revealed the mechanical sabotage, leading investigators to Trina. It was July 22, 2017, in a high-rise apartment in New Jersey. The night felt ordinary: warm air, cracked windows, echoing hallways, elevators chimed, traffic hummed, and faint music leaked through walls. Nothing suggesting the building would hold 2 deaths before midnight that same night. Among the tenants were Eric and Dana Wilkes, both 35 years old. They lived on the 15th floor of a mid-rise apartment building. They were newly married and known in the building for loud weekends. Parties ran late, music carried through the stairwells, and noise complaints followed them from the first month. When a downstairs neighbor, Noor Al-Hassan, began filing formal reports, the couple mocked her openly, filming hallway arguments and sharing the clips privately. Management issued fines. The behavior didn't stop. Noor was 29 and worked overnight catering shifts at a major international airport, sleeping during the day on a strict schedule. The parties regularly disrupted her rest. When she complained, harassment escalated. Notes under her door, mocking in the elevator, and recorded confrontations. Management documented the incidents but delayed taking stronger action. By July, tensions were common knowledge. On Friday night, Eric and Dana hosted another gathering. Alcohol flowed, music echoed down the stairwell. Near midnight, guests left. Eric and Dana decided to take trash and recycling down together before bed, choosing the stairwell they regularly used instead of the elevator. CCTV covered the stairwell from the 15th floor to the ground. At 11:39 p.m., Noor entered alone carrying a small bottle, knelt between the second and third floors, and poured a clear liquid across several steps, spreading it evenly before wiping the bottle clean and leaving. Maintenance later identified the liquid as cooking oil from her apartment. At 11:46 p.m., Eric and Dana entered the stairwell from the 15th floor, laughing, each carrying trash bags. Eric descended first. As he stepped onto the oiled section, his foot slipped forward. His center of gravity shifted backward. CCTV captured his arms flailing before he fell hard, striking the back of his head against the concrete edge of a step. He went limp immediately. Dana screamed and rushed down toward him. As she reached the same steps, she lost traction as well. Her feet slid out, and she fell sideways, her upper body twisting awkwardly. She struck the stair rail and collapsed partially on top of Eric. The camera showed her trying to push herself up, slipping repeatedly, her movements slowing as she remained pressed against his body in the stair wall. Within seconds, both stopped moving. No one else entered the stairwell for several minutes. At 12:02 a.m., another tenant opened the stairwell door from the first floor, saw the bodies, and ran to call 911. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Eric was pronounced dead at the scene. Dana had no pulse and could not be revived. The medical examiner ruled that Eric died from a fractured skull and massive brain bleeding caused by the backward fall. Dana died from positional asphyxia, her chest and airway compressed against the stairs and Eric's body, with petechial hemorrhages confirming prolonged oxygen deprivation. Investigators reviewed the stairwell footage, documenting the deliberate oil spill and Noor's timing. During questioning, she admitted planning the act as revenge. Noor was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive 30-year terms. The building later installed non-slip treads, expanded camera coverage, and tightened enforcement. Tenants avoided the stairwell for months. It was July 2015, in the foothills near Hinton, Alberta, where a summer adventure camp trained teenagers in survival skills and wilderness navigation. One of the camp's ridgeside trails wound through a forested slope bordered by dense spruce and shallow creeks. 28-year-old Mark Tiller had worked there for 5 years as a wilderness instructor, known for his quiet personality and skill with backcountry maintenance. That season, his co-worker Rachel Keene, 27, led most of the morning hikes and safety briefings. The two had briefly dated the year before but broke things off when Rachel began seeing another guide. Co-workers later said Mark became distant after that. He volunteered for night patrols and took on most of the solo trail work, clearing branches or checking sensor lines that detected animal movement near camp. Some instructors remembered him joking that certain trails should just be left to the wildlife, or that a bit of noise might scare off the morning groups. Nobody took it seriously. Mark had a dry sense of humor, and long workdays often ended with idle talk about bears and coyotes around the fire. By early July, camp attendance had peaked. On July 16th, the staff planned a short pre-breakfast hike for a small group of campers. Rachel led the front, followed by 2 counselors and 6 teens. The air was cool, the ground damp from overnight rain, and visibility was limited under thick tree cover. The group started along the East Ridge Trail at about 6:45 a.m. The plan was to circle toward the storage hut, where equipment for outdoor cooking was kept. As the group neared the hut, a faint beeping noise broke the morning quiet. One counselor thought it was a motion alarm. Small devices were attached to trees to track movement for wildlife studies. Before anyone could check, a deep growl echoed from behind the storage shed. A black bear, estimated at around 250 pounds, stepped out from the brush. Witnesses later said it moved toward a rope hanging near the shed, where chunks of raw meat were tied in a mesh bag. The smell had carried downwind toward the trail. Rachel told the campers to stay still and began backing away slowly. Behind her, the ground sloped downward, scattered with roots and wet leaves. She tripped and fell backward just as the bear turned toward the movement. Mark had been assigned to that section earlier in the week and was about 50 yards away on a side trail, clearing debris near the motion sensors. He froze, watching as the bear charged forward. The two counselors shouted and fired handheld flares from their belts, sending bright sparks across the clearing. The bear struck once with its paw, then retreated into the trees when the second flare ignited. Campers and staff carried Rachel back toward the main trail and radioed for help. Emergency crews arrived by helicopter within the hour, but she was pronounced dead at the scene from neck and chest injuries. Wildlife officers determined the bear had been drawn deliberately to the area. The bag of meat had been tied at shoulder height to one of the sensor lines, which were part of Mark's maintenance route. Investigators found his boot tracks near the shed, and a half-empty plastic feed bucket behind a locked supply crate with traces of blood and fat residue inside. Wildlife officers later tracked and euthanized the bear 2 days after the attack, following standard protocol for fatal incidents. When questioned, Mark admitted to placing the meat but claimed it was meant for a training demonstration, not to attract an active bear. The camp's management disputed that explanation, saying no such activity was scheduled that morning. He was charged with criminal negligence causing death and violating wildlife protection laws. The Ridgeside Trail was shut down permanently after the incident. The storage hut was dismantled the following season, and the area was fenced off to prevent access. The old wooden warning sign still stands at the tree line, its yellow letters faded by weather, marking where the trail once began. It was December 3rd, 2023, in Wichita, Kansas, late on a quiet Sunday night. The apartment complex was mostly dark, with only a few windows still lit. Heat hummed through the vents. Inside one unit, a desk lamp glowed, a computer screen stayed on, and a live stream continued uninterrupted. Aaron Cole was 26 years old and worked weekdays at an IT help desk for a regional insurance company in Wichita, Kansas. His job involved routine technical support, but in the evenings, he streamed video games from his apartment to a small, steady audience. He wasn't a professional player, yet he held moderator status in several online groups, giving him control over who could join matches. One regular player was a gamer known as Rook, who had played alongside Aaron for more than a year. Chat logs later reviewed by investigators showed Aaron repeatedly criticizing Rook's performance during matches. The comments were public and personal. Missed shots were mocked, losses blamed on him, and mistakes highlighted during live streams. Weeks before the incident, the harassment escalated. During a ranked match, Aaron used his moderator privileges to remove Rook mid-game after a mistake. The ban was immediate and public. Messages afterward showed Aaron telling Rook he didn't belong in higher-level matches. Rook stopped playing but continued watching Aaron's streams. On December 3rd, Aaron entered a small online tournament streamed publicly. Rook was not playing but followed the match in chat as Aaron made repeated remarks about dead-weight teammates. After a narrow win, Aaron laughed and moved on. Minutes later, Rook sent private messages seeking to talk. Aaron did not respond. Rook went silent. Aaron continued streaming, briefly stepping away to get a drink. At 11:02 p.m., a 911 call was placed reporting an active hostage situation at Aaron's apartment. The caller claimed someone inside was armed and threatening violence. Dispatch classified it as a high-risk emergency. Officers were sent immediately. Police body cameras activated as officers arrived at the complex. They stacked outside Aaron's door and knocked loudly. Inside the apartment, the live stream audio captured Aaron's confusion. He stepped back into frame, holding his phone, asking what was happening. The knocking escalated quickly. Officers forced entry with weapons raised, as shown on body camera footage. Aaron backed into the living room, raising his hands with his phone still visible. The live stream archive captured the same moment from inside the apartment, showing him retreating with open palms as commands came from different directions. As he stepped backward toward the hallway, one of his arms moved briefly out of view near the doorway. Officers later stated they interpreted the movement as a possible reach toward a weapon. Given the high-risk dispatch classification, an officer fired a single shot. The live stream camera fell to the floor as Aaron collapsed. Video cut out, but audio continued briefly. Shouting, radio traffic, then silence. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but Aaron was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as a single gunshot wound to the chest, with the round passing through the lung and heart and causing rapid, unsurvivable internal bleeding. Investigators traced the false emergency call to address spoofing software and online accounts belonging to Daniel Mendez, the individual known in gaming circles as Rook. They determined Mendez obtained Aaron's address through publicly shared details from past live streams and linked social media accounts, allowing him to place a convincing emergency call. Platform records, network activity, and preserved chat logs confirmed his identity and linked him to the call. Mendez was arrested and later convicted of making a false emergency report that resulted in death, a felony offense. He was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, with the court citing the foreseeable risk of lethal police response inherent in swatting cases. Authorities classified the incident as a fatal swatting attack. The live stream footage and police body camera recordings were preserved as evidence, and the case was later referenced by law enforcement in renewed warnings about swatting and online revenge. It was January 16, 2014. The morning air in Patna, India was thick. Breakfast preparation was underway in the kitchen of a small private boarding school, steam rising from aluminum pots as rice and lentils cooked for fewer than 60 resident students. Ramesh Singh, a 45-year-old cook who had worked in the school's kitchen for 8 years, wasn't supposed to be there that morning. He'd been terminated 3 weeks earlier after repeated complaints about hygiene violations and showing up drunk during meal preparation. The district education officer had finally acted on the headmistress's formal complaint, ending Ramesh's employment without severance. Colleagues said that Ramesh blamed the headmistress entirely for his firing. They said that he'd told them he worked there longer than she had, and the dismissal meant losing his small income and facing shame in his neighborhood. For 3 weeks, he'd watched from across the street as the replacement cook arrived each morning. He knew the kitchen routine perfectly, the unlocked side entrance that had no guard during early morning hours, and the chaos of morning preparation when nobody paid attention to who came and went. That morning, a student noticed Ramesh slipped into the kitchen at approximately 10:45 in the morning, carrying a small bottle containing approximately 30 milliliters of concentrated organophosphate pesticide, telling the clerk he needed it for crop treatment. The current cook had stepped outside to receive the vegetable delivery. Ramesh moved quickly to the nearly finished dal pot, pouring the entire bottle into the simmering lentils, stirring thoroughly so it dissolved completely and left no visible trace. He was gone within 90 seconds. By late morning, the dining hall filled with younger boarding students who ate their meals together under staff supervision. Teachers distributed steel plates as the dal was ladled over rice. The children, most from families surviving on less than 100 rupees daily, ate eagerly. Within 8 minutes, a 7-year-old girl began vomiting violently, then another child, then 5 more simultaneously. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Children clutched their stomachs, sweating profusely despite the cool weather, their pupils constricted to pinpoints. Several collapsed face first into their plates. Teachers screamed for help, trying to carry convulsing students toward the gate. But 3 teachers also began showing symptoms after tasting the food during service. Parents waiting outside rushed in, finding children unconscious and struggling to breathe. A teacher managed to call emergency services at 12:14 in the afternoon. The nearest hospital was approximately 7 miles away. Private vehicles began evacuating children immediately, but traffic and deteriorating conditions made transport agonizing. 21 students and 3 staff members were transported to nearby hospitals, overwhelming emergency departments unprepared for mass casualty poisoning. 4 children, aged 6 to 9, died within hours from acute respiratory failure, complicated by secondary hypoxic organ injury. The post-mortem examinations revealed severe neurotoxicity, pulmonary edema, and secondary hypoxic damage to multiple organs, consistent with acute organophosphate poisoning. Their small bodies had absorbed lethal concentrations of the pesticide through ingestion, causing their nervous systems to fail, while breathing became impossible. The school's CCTV footage showed Ramesh entering the side entrance with time-stamped grainy images that captured his movement, but not the exact stirring of the dal pot. So investigators still relied on the discarded bottle and vendor receipt to confirm the act. Investigators found the plastic pesticide bottle with a partially legible label, discarded 2 blocks away with his fingerprints partially intact. Ramesh was arrested later that evening. He was later convicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the court citing deliberate retaliation and the vulnerability of the victims as aggravating factors. It was September 18, 2018, in a rural township outside Yuba City, California. The evening air was still and warm as residents settled in after sunset, unaware that a calculated act of revenge was unfolding on a secluded property at the edge of farmland. Daniel Hargreave, 41, was known locally as a private contractor who handled renovation work for low-income housing. Multiple former clients later described disputes over incomplete work, withheld payments, and threats of legal action that never materialized. One of those clients was Miguel Alvarez, a 36-year-old farmhand who had hired Hargreave months earlier to repair a rental unit he shared with his family. Records showed Miguel paid in installments, but the work stalled. When Miguel pressed for refunds, Hargreave responded by filing a civil complaint accusing him of property damage, a claim later dismissed. Phone records showed escalating contact between the 2 men in the weeks before September 18th. That night, Hargreave agreed to meet Miguel at a rural property owned by a relative, after Miguel claimed he had cash to settle the dispute. What happened next was reconstructed through forensic evidence and surveillance footage recovered from nearby farm equipment cameras. Investigators determined that an altercation occurred near a storage shed shortly after Hargreave arrived. Blood evidence showed Hargreave sustained multiple stab wounds to the abdomen and upper thigh. The injuries caused significant blood loss, but did not damage major organs or arteries. A forensic pathologist later concluded the wounds were survivable with prompt medical care. Hargreave did not receive care. Instead, evidence showed he was moved while still alive. Tire impressions matched Miguel's vehicle, and drag marks led toward a capped septic system servicing an unused farmhouse on the property. The concrete access lid had been removed earlier that day. Investigators determined Hargreave was positioned face down at the open septic access, with his airway directly exposed to the confined gases. The lid was then replaced, and there were no signs of restraint or defensive movement consistent with rapid incapacitation. The autopsy revealed that Hargreave died from acute hydrogen sulfide exposure and oxygen deprivation. Toxicology results showed he was alive when exposed to the gas. The concentration levels within the tank would have caused rapid respiratory paralysis and loss of consciousness within seconds. Death followed shortly after. The stab wounds contributed to incapacitation, but were not the cause of death. Hargreave's body was discovered 3 days later when a maintenance worker arrived to service the septic system after pressure alarms were triggered. Emergency responders pronounced him dead at the scene. Miguel Alvarez was arrested after investigators reviewed phone records, vehicle data, and blood evidence linking him to the site. During questioning, he admitted to the confrontation and stabbing, but claimed he believed Hargreave would survive. Prosecutors argued the disposal was deliberate and retaliatory. They cited Miguel's knowledge of the septic system, the timing of the meeting, and the decision to leave without seeking help. He was charged with second-degree murder. At trial, the jury found that while the stabbing showed intent to harm, the act of placing Hargreave into the septic system demonstrated conscious disregard for life. Miguel was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Investigators concluded the case was a revenge killing, carried out not with a final blow, but by abandoning a living victim in an environment known to be lethal. It was June 14, 2016. A rural equipment yard in West Texas sat quietly under the early morning sky. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across rows of stacked materials and idle machinery. The air was still and dry, typical for the season. No wind stirred the dust between the storage bays. The yard was empty except for one person on duty. Xander Holtz was 34 years old and worked as an independent hauler, He had a reputation for moving fast and cutting corners when he thought no one was watching. Over the years, he had skipped full load inspections more times than he could count, always prioritizing speed over procedure. It saved him time, and time meant more runs. He was known among other drivers as someone who took risks but always seemed to get away with it. His truck was older but well-maintained, and he prided himself on completing routes faster than anyone else. That morning, he arrived before dawn to pick up a load of bundled steel pipes that had been stacked the night before. He was alone with the yard coordinator, Lena Markham, age 29, who managed dispatch and load releases. Their relationship had soured weeks earlier after Xander publicly blamed her for a delayed payout that cost him a contract. She had sent him a message days before that read, "Check your load next time." He never responded. The pipes were stacked unevenly on the flatbed trailer. Only 2 straps secured the load instead of the required 4. The upper tier sat off-center, visibly imbalanced, and had been intentionally stacked without chocks, making it dependent entirely on strap tension. Markham approved the release anyway. Xander walked around the trailer once, then climbed onto the bed to adjust a loose strap near the top. Security footage from the yard gate captured him standing on the trailer deck, leaning over the bundles. Markham stood nearby, watching but not moving. The camera angle showed her arms crossed, her posture still. As Xander loosened the first strap, the tension holding the upper tier gave way. 3 steel pipes rolled off the stack in quick succession. The first struck him across the torso, pinning him against the trailer bed. The second followed immediately, crushing his chest. The third hit his shoulder and knocked him sideways. His head struck the edge rail as he fell. The weight of the pipes compressed his ribcage, causing massive internal trauma. He showed no further movement. Markham remained stationary for approximately 90 seconds before contacting emergency services. Emergency services arrived 23 minutes later. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene. The cause was blunt force trauma and crush injuries to the chest and head. Investigators reviewed security footage and found the load had been improperly secured from the start. Missing chocks, uneven stacking, and insufficient straps were documented, along with text messages between Xander Holtz and Lena Markham, including her prior warning. Phone and dispatch records confirmed Markham had been at the yard over an hour before Holtz arrived and had overseen the pipe stacking the previous evening. Witnesses from the previous shift verified her presence during loading operations. Authorities determined she knowingly approved an unsafe load following a personal conflict. She was charged and later convicted of manslaughter, receiving a 9-year sentence with parole eligibility. The equipment yard was fined for safety violations, permanently revised its procedures, and the case closed 4 months later. It was June 18, 2017, when Molly Anderson's financial predatory behavior finally led to her brutal death in an isolated Colorado mountain cabin. The 32-year-old financial advisor had built her career on stealing from the most vulnerable members of society, but her greed would cost her everything. Molly possessed a charming personality that masked her sociopathic tendencies and complete lack of empathy for elderly victims. She specialized in targeting seniors with dementia, using her credentials to gain trust before systematically draining their life savings. 3 months earlier, Molly had targeted 78-year-old Margaret Doyle, a retired librarian living in a modest nursing home. Using forged documents and Margaret's stolen identity, Molly transferred the elderly woman's entire retirement fund into offshore accounts, leaving her unable to pay for care. Camille Doyle, Margaret's 27-year-old granddaughter, discovered the theft when the nursing home called about unpaid bills. Camille worked as a retail manager and had been Margaret's only family since her parents died. Watching her beloved grandmother cry about losing her home transformed Camille's grief into murderous rage. Camille spent months tracking down the stolen money through bank records. Her investigation led her to Molly, who had already spent Margaret's life savings on luxury cars and expensive vacations. The complete lack of remorse Molly showed when confronted fueled Camille's desire for revenge. Molly owned a remote family cabin in the Colorado mountains, located 50 miles from the nearest town. She used this isolated retreat whenever authorities began investigating her financial crimes. believing the remote location provided perfect cover. Camille learned about the cabin through surveillance and social media posts. She noted that Molly retreated there whenever she felt threatened by law enforcement, always traveling alone with no security systems or neighbors for miles. On that June evening, Molly arrived at the cabin planning to lay low until her latest investigation cooled down. She had recently stolen from 3 more elderly victims and needed time for the heat to die down. Camille had been watching the cabin for weeks, learning Molly's routines and preparing for the perfect opportunity. She waited until Molly was settled inside before making her move, knowing no one would hear the screams in the isolated wilderness. Camille confronted Molly at the cabin, presenting detailed evidence of the theft and demanding the return of her grandmother's money. When Molly laughed and claimed the elderly woman was too senile to manage money anyway, Camille's rage exploded into violence. She attacked Molly with a fireplace poker, fracturing her skull and knocking her unconscious. Camille then tied the unconscious Molly to a chair in the cabin's basement and waited for her to regain consciousness before revealing her plan for prolonged torture. Over the next several hours, Camille systematically broke Molly's fingers and toes with a hammer while forcing her to watch videos of Margaret crying about losing her home. She wanted Molly to understand the pain she had caused to innocent people. Camille used a knife to slowly carve dollar signs into Molly's arms and chest, symbolizing the money she had stolen from vulnerable seniors. Each cut was deliberate and calculated to maximize pain while keeping Molly conscious as long as possible. Molly finally died from shock and blood loss after hours of systematic torture. Her body bore evidence of Camille's methodical revenge, with dozens of cuts spelling out the word thief across her torso. Camille set fire to the cabin with Molly's body still inside, believing the flames would erase every trace of her revenge. She drove back to the city, confident that investigators would find nothing more than an accidental fire. However, forensic experts later discovered fractures in the charred remains that pointed to violent assault before death. Combined with financial records linking Camille to Molly and evidence of premeditation, the investigation built a solid case. The death was reclassified from accidental to homicide, leading to Camille's arrest for first-degree murder. It was January 17, 2018, at Whistler Blackcomb in British Columbia. Low fog flattened depth, wind hardened slabs, and patrol posted warnings. Yet by mid-morning, crowds moved normally, masking danger. One of the skiers on the slope was Lena Park, who was 26 and treated skiing more like something to post than something to enjoy. She built a small but steady following with quick edits and risky dares. Brands sent her gear, resorts shared her videos, and her longtime college friend Mara Holt, 26, was often beside her. Mara skied carefully, avoided attention, and asked more than once not to be filmed, but Lena ignored it. Fear turned into jokes, falls into captions, and the views kept growing. Mara worked in logistics and liked order, which Lena brushed off as boring, but Mara relied on to feel in control. Over time, the teasing stopped being casual. Lena tagged Mara without asking, focused on her fear, and turned mistakes into content. On this trip, Lena said she would stop. She didn't. That morning's goal was a sponsored post, a steep line that looked fearless. Conditions made it risky. Wind-loaded snow sat on refrozen crust, and patrol had flagged several side bowls as unsafe for aggressive skiing. Lena dismissed the warnings. She needed something dramatic. On the lift, Lena filmed Mara's reluctance and posted it live. The comments laughed. At the top, Mara said they should turn back. Lena skied a short distance into a side bowl and stopped at a rollover, calling for Mara to follow so she could film the descent. From above, the surface looked smooth. Lena dropped in first to set the angle. She made 2 controlled turns and stopped near a narrow section where coverage thinned. Mara followed slowly, stopping several feet uphill. Lena shouted for her to come closer, angling her camera back uphill. What happened next was brief and visible. Mara stepped forward and shoved Lena hard from behind, both hands to her upper back. The push knocked Lena off balance before she could reset her stance. Her skis crossed. She slid immediately, accelerating downslope. Lena tried to recover, but the surface alternated between ice and breakable crust. One ski edge caught and released. A pole snapped. Her body tumbled, striking exposed rock beneath the snow. Her helmet took multiple impacts. She slid until her body folded sharply against the slope and stopped. Mara stood still for several seconds. Then she skied down. Lena was alive when Mara reached her. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Blood pooled near her head. One leg was visibly twisted. Mara waved for help. Another skier stopped and contacted patrol. The first responder arrived within minutes. Lena lost consciousness during transfer to the sled. She was pronounced dead at the clinic. The coroner reported severe blunt force trauma, skull fracture, cervical spine injury, collapsed lung, and internal bleeding. Death occurred shortly after the fall. No substances were found. Investigators later reviewed fixed mountain cameras and multiple phone videos posted earlier that morning. The footage showed the shove clearly. The patrol warnings were visible in frame. Mara was charged with manslaughter and later accepted a plea deal, receiving a 12-year federal sentence with parole eligibility after 8. She deleted her accounts and returned all sponsor equipment. Lena's final video stayed online for several days before removal. The run reopened after the next snowfall erased the tracks. It was November 2016 in rural Pennsylvania. The air around the small hillside cemetery stayed damp after a week of rain, and puddles filled the gravel paths between rows of graves. The caretaker, James Holloway, had worked there for 15 years. People in town said no one trimmed grass straighter than him. But that fall, things changed. The cemetery hired a younger man named Darren Lutz as the new head groundsman. Darren had only been there 3 years but was good with reports and safety paperwork. When James got written up for missing logs, he lost his title. Those who knew him said James took it hard. He kept doing his job, mowing and cleaning, but stopped talking to most of the crew. Over time, he started showing up after dark, saying he wanted to finish tasks when no one else was around. It wasn't unusual. The small crew often left the gate keys under the office mat for him, and nobody questioned his habits. The cemetery's new burial section sat downhill near the back fence, supported by a retaining wall that held back soft hillside soil. After several days of rain, water had pooled behind that wall. Darren, now the supervisor, wanted to inspect it for pressure cracks before the weekend. The night before, James was seen walking near that same area with a toolbox. He told a neighbor he was patching erosion. In truth, he had loosened several bolts along the wall's lower row. Most were half buried under clay, so the tampering wasn't visible unless the soil was cleared away. His plan, according to later reports, wasn't to cause a collapse, only to make the wall shift enough to startle Darren. That morning, Darren parked his truck close to the slope to keep his radio in range. The signal often dropped near the fence line. He carried a probe to test the surface and began checking each section. 2 women visiting relatives' graves said they saw him crouching near the center of the wall, speaking into his radio. Moments later, a cracking sound cut through the quiet. The limestone face bowed forward and buckled. A heavy wave of wet clay and rock spilled out, sweeping Darren off his feet and covering him completely. One witness ran toward the main office for help, while the other tried digging with a flower vase from a nearby headstone, but the soil packed too fast. Maintenance staff reached the site minutes later, but the area was unstable. The wall had folded inward, leaving only a section of Darren's jacket visible. Rescue teams worked carefully over the next 2 days, removing the soil by hand to prevent another collapse. When investigators examined the frame, they found several missing bolts and fresh wrench marks on the remaining supports. James didn't return to work after that day. His house was found empty, his truck gone, and his paycheck still uncollected. Police never located the missing bolts or his toolbox. Some believed he panicked and fled. Others thought he'd planned it all along. The cemetery reopened weeks later with a new concrete wall built under county supervision. The area where the collapse happened was leveled and turned into open lawn, no longer used for burials. Locals still remember James Holloway as the quiet man who kept the grass perfect. His old push mower still sits in the shed. Blades rusted but lined up neatly, just the way he used to leave things. It was August 14, 2018, off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, aboard a small contractor-run dive vessel supporting inspection work. The sea was calm, Visibility was good, and multiple boats were anchored along the reef. Divers moved methodically across the deck, checking gear, logging depths, and setting cameras before entering the water. From above, everything looked controlled. Among the divers on board that morning was Andrew Collins, 34, a marine survey technician who spent most of his working life underwater. He inspected docks, pilings, and submerged cables, often logging hundreds of dives a year. He was experienced and methodical, favoring surface-supplied air for longer jobs that required staying in one position rather than descending deep. The assignment that day was routine, a shallow inspection for a private contractor, the kind of work he had done many times before. Ryan Mercer, 36, was also assigned to the boat. He and Andrew had worked together for years, but their relationship had soured after a dispute over inspection records that cost Ryan future work. Colleagues later described months of unresolved tension and deliberate avoidance. Despite that history, scheduling placed them on the same charter that morning. Andrew entered the water first, wearing a helmet-mounted camera connected to a surface-supplied air hose from the deck compressor. Crew members later confirmed the line was checked and secured before descent. Deck cameras showed Ryan remaining near the compressor after Andrew submerged. As a separate diver surfaced unexpectedly and required assistance at the rail, a concurrent safety issue briefly drew crew attention away from the compressor area, allowing Ryan to move behind stacked tanks and handle Andrew's air hose for several seconds. Underwater footage shows Andrew working steadily along the reef wall. His breathing is calm as he adjusts his position and continues the inspection. About 9 minutes in, the audio shifts. Breathing becomes uneven. Air bubbles drop sharply. Andrew pauses, looks toward the hose, and tugs it once. He signals upward and begins to swim, but the line slackens. His movements grow frantic as the air supply stops, his hands grasping behind him as he kicks upward without oxygen. Deck footage captures a crew member noticing the hose tension change. Someone shouts that Andrew is moving fast. The line is pulled in, but it goes slack. Divers rush to the rail. Underwater, Andrew drops his tools. His camera shakes violently. He releases the hose and kicks upward, but his ascent slows. The footage captures uncontrolled movement, then a sudden stillness as the camera tilts toward open water. A safety diver enters the water within moments. Andrew is reached near the bottom and brought to the surface. CPR begins immediately on deck. Emergency services were contacted at 11:26 a.m., according to dispatch logs. Despite resuscitation attempts, Andrew is pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as hypoxic asphyxia from a sudden loss of air supply. The helmet and regulators showed no internal failure. Investigators determined Andrew did not activate the bailout valve before losing consciousness. They noted that sudden air deprivation can rapidly cause confusion, air hunger, and loss of coordination, which may explain why he failed to use the emergency air supply despite his training. Inspection of the air hose revealed a deliberate partial cut that failed under pressure once underwater movement increased load on the damaged section. Investigators reviewed deck footage, compressor logs, and dive video, placing Ryan at the hose shortly before the air loss. Messages recovered from his phone showed explicit resentment toward Andrew over lost work. Mercer was arrested and later convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in California State Prison. The dive operator updated safety rules, requiring constant airline monitoring and restricted access to compressor systems. It was October 17, 2015. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across a family-operated grain farm outside Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, Canada. Derek Lavoie, a 29-year-old farmhand, approached the 40-foot steel grain silo with a wrench and his work gloves. Derek had worked on his uncle's farm since graduating high school, choosing agricultural labor over college. He was reliable and known for staying late to handle equipment repairs that others avoided. Unmarried and living in a small rental house near the property, he spent most evenings maintaining machinery or helping his cousin Gareth with field work. His hands were calloused from years of manual labor, and his friends said he took pride in being the go-to person for difficult mechanical problems around the farm. Grain silos store thousands of bushels of wheat or barley, with augers moving grain from bottom to top. Clogs create voids and unstable bridges that can collapse suddenly, and moving grain can engulf a person in seconds. Most farms require lockouts and spotters, but smaller operations often skip these precautions during busy seasons. That afternoon, Derek needed to clear a jammed auger inside the main silo. The blockage had stopped operations for 2 days, delaying shipments to a regional grain distributor. Derek's uncle was traveling, leaving him and Gareth to handle the problem. What Derek didn't know was that Gareth, his 36-year-old cousin, had recently discovered Derek had been sleeping with his wife. The betrayal had been eating at Gareth for weeks, transforming years of camaraderie into bitter resentment. Derek climbed the external ladder and entered through the top hatch, without a safety harness or fall arrest, descending into the grain-filled chamber. Gareth remained outside, supposedly monitoring the auger controls. Standard procedure required the auger's power to be completely disconnected during internal work, with multiple safety locks engaged. Gareth had told Derek everything was secure, but he had deliberately bypassed the emergency disengage mechanism, leaving the system vulnerable to accidental or intentional activation. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, Derek reached the blockage point 15 feet below the grain surface. He radioed Gareth that he'd located the jam and was working to clear it. The radio's reply came through as static. Inside the steel shell, reception was poor. Moments later, without warning or explanation, the auger roared to life. The mechanical screw began churning violently, creating immediate and catastrophic grain movement. Derek shouted into his radio as thousands of pounds of wheat shifted around him, the grain flowing like liquid toward the auger's intake. The suction pulled him sideways into the steel wall with crushing force. His torso compressed against the silo's interior as grain continued flowing, pinning him completely. A farmhand working near the equipment shed heard Derek's muffled screams and ran to the silo base. He peered through the 6-inch inspection port and could see grain packed tightly against the silo wall, with no movement where Derek had been working moments earlier. The witness immediately shut down the main power and called emergency services, but the grain's pressure made extraction impossible without specialized equipment. Rescue teams spent 3 hours carefully removing grain to access Derek's body. He had suffocated within minutes of entrapment, unable to expand his chest against the compressed wheat. The autopsy revealed the official cause of death as compression asphyxia with associated crush injuries caused by grain entrapment. Provincial investigators sealed the silo and found the safety switches had been deliberately tampered that morning. Forensic testing confirmed the modifications were recent, and surveillance showed Gareth repeatedly near the control panel before the accident. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and criminal negligence causing death. He was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment under Canadian law, with parole eligibility set decades into the future. It was February 14th, 2017 in Plano, Texas. The evening was warm for winter, and the neighborhood was quiet as Marcus Thompson pulled into his driveway after work. Marcus, 38, was a successful real estate agent whose personal life had begun to unravel months earlier. Financial records later confirmed an ongoing affair with his secretary, hotel stays, gifts, and unexplained charges. 3 weeks before Valentine's Day, his wife Diana, 36, uncovered the evidence while preparing tax paperwork. Phone records and receipts confirmed what she suspected. She did not confront him, and to friends, nothing appeared outwardly different. Phone data later recovered by investigators showed that shortly after discovering the affair, Diana searched repeatedly for residential water heaters, scalding temperatures, and how quickly hot water could cause incapacitating burns. No service calls or repair requests were ever made, despite her later statements that she had been inspecting the heater. On the afternoon of Valentine's Day, while Marcus was at work, Diana accessed the gas water heater in the utility closet. Inspectors later confirmed the thermostat had been manually adjusted far beyond recommended safety limits, high enough to cause severe burns within seconds of contact. There was no mechanical malfunction, and no evidence of accidental adjustment. That evening, Marcus returned home, ate dinner, and mentioned showering before bed. Sometime after 10 p.m., he entered the upstairs bathroom and turned on the water. The temperature surged almost immediately. Medical experts later testified that exposure at that level would have caused instant pain and rapid skin damage, triggering a reflexive withdrawal that likely caused him to lose footing on the wet tub surface. Evidence showed Marcus attempted to step back, but slipped inside the tub as the water continued running. Neighbors later reported hearing a single heavy thud through the shared wall, followed by the sound of water that did not shut off. There was no further noise. Call logs showed that more than 20 minutes passed before emergency services were contacted. First responders found Marcus collapsed in the tub, with extensive scald injuries across his torso, arms, and upper legs. He was alive but in critical condition, showing signs of shock and severe thermal trauma. He was transported to a regional burn center, where he died early the next morning from complications related to the burns and resulting organ failure. The death was initially considered a household accident. That changed when investigators examined the water heater. The temperature setting exceeded manufacturer limits and local safety codes, and could only have been changed manually. Diana's statements about when she last accessed the heater shifted over time. Phone data recovered during the investigation showed repeated searches related to scalding injuries and survivability in the weeks leading up to Marcus's death. Prosecutors argued the act was deliberate, revenge carried out by altering a lethal domestic system and allowing the consequences to unfold. The defense claimed recklessness. The jury ultimately convicted Diana of manslaughter, citing conscious disregard of a known deadly hazard. Marcus's death was ruled preventable. Investigators concluded it was not mechanical failure, but an intentional setup that turned an ordinary routine into a fatal act of revenge. It was August 9, 2017. Central Arizona baked under the afternoon sun. The temperature had climbed past 112 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon. Heat radiated off the asphalt and concrete in visible waves. The air was dry and still, offering no relief. A small rental duplex sat at the end of a quiet residential street, its exterior walls absorbing the relentless heat. Vina Crum was 27 years old and worked part-time providing childcare assistance. She was known as reliable and cautious, someone who followed routines and avoided unnecessary risks. She lived in the duplex with her young child and had recently filed multiple complaints about the property. She had also reported the property caretaker for harassment. Eric Halden was a 32-year-old man responsible for repairs and tenant issues across several units. His employment contract explicitly required a 24/7 response for lockouts involving children or emergencies. Their interactions had grown hostile after her complaints. Days before, he had sent her a message warning that she would regret making trouble. The duplex had an exterior door with an automatic lock that was known to jam in extreme heat. The caretaker had recently disabled the spare key access without notifying tenants. That afternoon, Vina returned home from shopping. She stepped inside briefly, then went back outside to retrieve something from the car. The door closed behind her and locked automatically. The lock had jammed. Her phone was in the car. She retrieved it and immediately called the caretaker. He did not answer. She called again. No response. A neighbor's motion-activated security camera captured her attempting to force the door open with her shoulder, throwing her full weight against it repeatedly. She tried the windows, but they were locked from the inside. She resumed slamming against the door, exerting herself continuously in direct sunlight. Her hands began to bleed from scraping against the door frame. The concrete driveway and surrounding asphalt amplified the heat. Direct sunlight reflected off every surface. There was no shade. Vina's movements became slower. She sat down briefly, then stood and resumed forcing the door, her breathing visible and labored. She tried calling neighbors, but most were at work. The footage showed her leaning against the door between efforts, her posture weakening. The camera recorded her collapsing near the door. She did not get back up. Inside, her child could be seen through the window crying. A neighbor eventually noticed and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and forced entry. Vina was unresponsive. They pronounced her dead at the scene. Her child was found dehydrated but alive and was transported to a medical facility for observation. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as heat stroke, with severe dehydration listed as a contributing factor, estimating exposure to extreme heat for 40 to 50 minutes while she repeatedly exerted herself trying to force entry. Investigators reviewed security footage and phone records showing multiple unanswered calls to the caretaker. Maintenance reports confirmed he had previously acknowledged the lock's tendency to jam in extreme heat. Phone data placed him less than 2 blocks away for over 20 minutes during the incident. Text records documented prior threats and her complaints. Authorities concluded his inaction was deliberate and retaliatory. He was convicted of manslaughter by reckless endangerment and sentenced to 6 years in state prison. The property management company faced civil penalties. It was September 5, 2018, on a busy beach in Mumbai, India. As the afternoon heat lingered, responders later warned that shallow holes where vendors had dumped hot coals still concealed buried embers beneath the sand. Families passed food stalls and grills, with nothing to suggest what would unfold minutes later. Ananya Rao was 19, a first-year education student commuting from Andheri. She tutored children and helped at her mother's tailoring shop. Quiet and conflict-averse, she came to the beach between classes and work, leaving her phone face down on her towel to rest. Her circle was small. That afternoon, a friend brought Rohit Malakar, 25, who had been messaging her for weeks. 2 days earlier, Ananya had blocked him after filing a brief harassment complaint with her college, which led to him being barred from a campus tutoring program. Near a snack cart, he approached her again and asked her out. She declined in front of others. Several people nearby recognized him from the earlier dispute. He walked away without responding. As evening approached, most of the group left to find food. Ananya stayed behind, lying face down to block the glare. A short distance away, shallow holes where vendors had dumped hot coals dotted the beach, left behind after portable braziers were moved earlier in the afternoon. Beneath the sand, charcoal embers remained active, insulated by packed grains. Beach maintenance had not yet cleared the area, a common problem in sections without constant supervision, where unauthorized cooking was rarely enforced. Footage from a nearby beachfront cafe later showed Rohit returning alone to one of the shallow holes. He avoided direct contact with the sand. Instead, he used a flat metal food tray discarded near the grills to scrape and lift sand directly from above the embers. A faint shimmer of heat was visible in the footage above the hole. He tipped the tray twice, testing distance rather than touch, then carried it away, holding it extended from his body. The same camera showed him walking back toward Ananya, who remained motionless on her towel. He dropped the heated sand directly onto her head and shoved her face down with both hands before recoiling almost immediately from the heat. Ananya convulsed, arms scraping the ground as sand flooded her mouth and nose. Her cries were muffled, choked by grit. The sand caused immediate blistering to exposed skin, and inhalation drew superheated particles into her airway. Later medical findings showed that inhaled superheated sand had burned and obstructed her airway within seconds, causing rapid respiratory failure. Rohit was seen leaving several seconds later without the tray. When Ananya was later found, she was unresponsive. Her face was buried in sand that remained hot enough to burn rescuers when they tried to clear it from her mouth and nose. The skin around her mouth and cheeks was blistered and peeling. Sand was compacted into her nostrils and lips. There were no signs of a struggle beyond scrape marks in the sand beside her arms. A passerby noticed her lack of movement and ran for help. A vendor called the regional emergency number at approximately 5:02 p.m. Municipal lifeguards arrived within 3 minutes, followed by an ambulance from City Medical Services approximately 6 minutes later. Attempts to clear her airway and resuscitate her were unsuccessful. The autopsy confirmed death from mechanical suffocation and severe airway burns caused by inhaling superheated sand, which rapidly closed the throat and led to quick oxygen loss. Partial bystander videos and footage from the beachfront cafe captured the assault and the minutes-long delay before help arrived, later becoming central evidence in the investigation. Rohit was identified and detained that night. After a 4-year trial, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. In the months that followed, local authorities ordered a ban on dumping hot coals on the beach and increased enforcement against unauthorized cooking. It was December 8, 2019, when Sabrina Lowell's home-wrecking affair finally led to her death in the most brutal way imaginable. The 29-year-old real estate agent had built her career on charm and manipulation, but her greatest conquest would become her downfall when she targeted the wrong family. Sabrina possessed a narcissistic personality that thrived on stealing what belonged to others. She specialized in targeting married men, viewing their wives as obstacles rather than human beings with feelings. Her stunning looks and calculated seduction techniques had ended dozens of marriages without any remorse for the destruction she caused. Sabrina had seduced David Anderson, a successful architect married to Kelly Anderson. She systematically targeted him during house showings, using her real estate expertise to create intimate situations. She convinced him that his wife didn't appreciate him, and that he deserved someone better who understood his ambitions. Kelly Anderson, 35, had been married to David for 12 years and was raising their twin daughters when Sabrina entered their lives like a predator. The devoted mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper to support David's career, never suspecting her husband was having an affair with their real estate agent. When David left his family, he drained their joint bank accounts and moved in with Sabrina, using their life savings. Kelly discovered the affair through credit card statements, showing expensive hotel stays and jewelry purchases. Watching her 8-year-old daughters cry themselves to sleep, asking why daddy didn't love them, transformed her grief into murderous rage. Sabrina flaunted the relationship on social media, posting photos of expensive vacations and designer gifts that David bought with his family's money. She showed no remorse for destroying a marriage, and seemed to enjoy the power she held over both David and his abandoned family. The Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami had been their regular meeting place during the affair. Sabrina booked the same penthouse suite monthly, creating a romantic sanctuary where she had systematically stolen another woman's husband. Kelly learned about these getaways through private investigator reports and credit card records. On that December evening, Kelly intercepted David's phone and sent Sabrina a text asking her to meet at their usual suite. Sabrina arrived at 7 p.m. expecting a romantic evening, completely unaware that the betrayed wife had been planning this confrontation for months. Kelly was waiting when Sabrina entered with champagne and lingerie, clearly expecting to celebrate another successful manipulation. The confrontation began with Kelly calmly explaining how Sabrina's affair had destroyed her family and left her children traumatized by their father's abandonment. Sabrina showed no remorse and bragged about stealing David, claiming Kelly had been a boring wife who didn't deserve him. She laughed about the children's tears and suggested Kelly should be grateful for being freed from an unhappy marriage. The complete lack of empathy triggered something primal in Kelly. She struck Sabrina with the champagne bottle, causing her to fall and hit her head on the marble coffee table. The blow caused a severe concussion, leaving Sabrina disoriented and unable to defend herself properly. Kelly dragged the dazed Sabrina to the suite's balcony on the 20th floor, overlooking Miami's glittering skyline. She forced her against the balcony railing, gripping her shoulders tightly. Sabrina's head cleared enough to realize the danger. She struggled desperately, clawing at Kelly's hands while pleading for mercy. But Kelly was stronger, fueled by months of rage over every cruel thing Sabrina had said about the children. With one final violent shove, Kelly pushed her over the railing and let gravity do the rest. Sabrina plummeted through the night air, her screams ending when her body struck the pavement 200 feet below. Kelly cleaned the suite and escaped through the service elevator. Security initially believed Sabrina had jumped due to relationship problems. However, the investigation eventually uncovered Kelly's connection and evidence of the confrontation, leading to her arrest. It was February 2018 on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. A small roadside motel sat just off the highway, a narrow building with faded paint and a flickering vacancy sign that buzzed through the night. It wasn't much, but it stayed busy enough with travelers and truck drivers passing through. The manager, 29-year-old Sophie Dalton, handled nearly everything herself. She lived in a small room behind the front desk, working long hours to keep the place running. Most nights she balanced the books, checked cameras, and made sure the laundry room finished before dawn. For several months, the motel had dealt with a troublesome tenant named Leonard Price. He was in his 40s and had rented one of the end units, paying weekly in cash. At first, he kept to himself, but later guests complained about loud music and shouting. Sophie warned him several times before evicting him for unpaid rent and repeated disturbances. Employees later said he didn't take it well. After being kicked out, he parked near the property on several nights, watching the front office from his truck, before driving off when the lights turned off. The motel had an old boiler system that heated water for all the rooms. It sat inside a small utility wing behind the laundry area, next to the janitor's closet. Leonard had helped repair it months earlier, tightening a few fittings when the system leaked during the winter. It worked fine after that, though no licensed technician ever inspected his work. Sophie sometimes joked that the motel held together mostly out of luck. On the night of February 9th, the temperature had dropped into the mid-30s. Sophie stayed up late finishing the night audit, a routine check of cash receipts and online bookings, while the janitor mopped the hallway. Around 11 p.m., two guests were outside smoking near the parking lot, facing the utility wing. They later told investigators they heard a sharp hiss, followed by a heavy metallic thump. Seconds later, the steel door to the boiler room bulged outward and blew off its hinges. The explosion sent scalding steam and hot water flooding into the narrow hallway. One of the smokers, a man from room 7, ran toward the building when he heard shouting. Through the steam, he saw Sophie trying to reach the front door. He pulled her partway into the lobby, but she collapsed before they made it outside. The janitor escaped through the laundry exit with minor burns. The witnesses called 911 as alarms in the office, and nearby rooms began to beep from the sudden heat. Firefighters arrived within minutes, shutting down the remaining gas lines and ventilating the wing. The boiler tank had ruptured near its base, splitting along a welded seam. Investigators later found that the safety relief valve, designed to vent excess pressure, had been tightened fully shut. Threads on the valve showed tool marks that matched a wrench, suggesting deliberate tampering. Records confirmed that Leonard Price was the last person to perform any repairs on that boiler before his eviction. The damage to the building was extensive. Ceiling panels in the hallway had peeled from the heat, and sections of the wall framing were warped from the pressure wave. Sophie was taken to a Reno hospital but died shortly after arrival from severe burns and inhalation injuries. The janitor told police he had seen Leonard's truck parked near the service road less than an hour before the blast. Detectives located Leonard 3 days later at a relative's property near Carson City. He was arrested without incident after neighbors reported a pickup matching the motel's surveillance photo parked in the driveway. Investigators recovered burned work clothes and a set of tools consistent with those used on the boiler. During questioning, Leonard denied involvement, but could not explain why the safety valve showed fresh wrench marks matching his equipment. He was later charged with second-degree murder and arson resulting in death. The trial concluded the following year, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The motel closed temporarily after the incident. Renovations began that summer under new management, replacing the entire heating system with modern units. When the building reopened the next year, the room numbers had been changed. Units 12 through 15, where the hallway damage had been worst, were removed from the layout entirely. Guests who stayed later said they never noticed anything unusual, except that the numbering skipped from 11 straight to 16. It was April 9th, 2018 in Columbus, Ohio. During a regular weekday shift at a regional distribution warehouse, forklifts moved between aisles, conveyor belts hummed without pause, and workers cycled through breaks on staggered schedules. The environment felt routine, noisy, and familiar. Another ordinary morning inside an industrial workspace. Mark Ellison was 41 years old and had worked in warehouse logistics for nearly 8 years. His job kept him moving between inventory racks, shipping stations, and loading docks, handling counts and labels on rotating schedules. Co-workers described him as blunt and private. He took breaks alone and rarely joined conversations. One issue followed him throughout the building: lunches disappearing from the shared refrigerator. Over time, several employees believed Mark was responsible. He denied it whenever the topic came up, and no proof ever surfaced. Nathan Reed, 34, worked the same shift in a different section of the warehouse. Unlike Mark, Nathan was vocal about the problem. Over the course of a month, he lost at least 4 packed lunches. He reported it twice to a supervisor, but the fridge had no lock and no camera coverage inside. Nothing changed. According to co-workers, tension grew between the two men. Nathan openly blamed Mark, and Mark responded by dismissing the accusations. The conflict stayed quiet but unresolved. Nathan chose retaliation without confrontation. He later told investigators he wanted to stop the lunch theft by sending a message. The night before, he prepared a sandwich layered with concentrated ghost pepper extract, a novelty product labeled with warnings about extreme physical distress. He wrapped it, wrote his name on the bag, and placed it in the shared refrigerator before the morning shift. Shortly before noon, office CCTV showed Mark entering the break room alone. He removed Nathan's labeled sandwich, sat near the vending machines, and took a bite. Within seconds, he stopped, coughed sharply, and pushed back his chair. He stood breathing unevenly, one hand pressed to his chest. Witnesses later said he appeared confused and unsteady. Mark staggered a few steps, leaned briefly against the vending machine, then collapsed. One co-worker ran for help while another called 911 at 12:17 p.m. Employees attempted basic assistance until paramedics arrived minutes later. Mark showed no response and was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as fatal cardiac arrhythmia precipitated by an acute stress response. An undiagnosed heart murmur made him vulnerable to sudden rhythm failure. The intense physiological stress caused by the pepper exposure, sympathetic nervous system surge, rapid heart rate, blood pressure spike, and oxygen demand precipitated the fatal event. There were no drugs or alcohol involved. Investigators reviewed CCTV footage, break room video, and employee interviews. Nathan admitted to deliberately preparing the sandwich to punish the person he believed was stealing from him. Prosecutors determined that intentionally tampering with food using a known extreme irritant constituted reckless conduct with foreseeable risk. Nathan was charged with involuntary manslaughter under Ohio law and later sentenced to 6 years in state prison. Authorities classified the case as a revenge killing carried out without intent to murder. Afterward, the warehouse removed the shared refrigerator and installed individual lockers. Food tampering was added to termination-level offenses. Safety briefings began referencing the case as an example of how retaliation can turn a minor grievance into a fatal act. It was June 18, 2013. The municipal police headquarters in La Paz, Bolivia, sat under cloudless skies, its basement evidence rooms holding more than just confiscated property. Inside one of these windowless concrete spaces, used as an off-the-books overflow locker, a 26-year-old citizen rights activist named Carlos Rojas was about to begin a slow death that would expose systemic abuse within the city's detention system. Carlos had spent 3 years working with a grassroots transparency organization, documenting cases of police corruption and extortion in La Paz's working-class neighborhoods. He wasn't a lawyer or journalist, just a community organizer with a notebook and stubborn conviction. His recent report had detailed specific instances of officers demanding bribes from street vendors and unlawfully detaining citizens for fabricated offenses. Carlos had mastered this methodical approach, building cases that had previously led to 2 officer suspensions. On June 18th, Officer Eduardo Morales, a 41-year-old police sergeant named in Carlos's latest report, arrested him on fabricated drug possession charges. Morales had a documented history of detainee abuse, including 3 prior complaints that had been administratively dismissed. Instead of processing Carlos through normal booking procedures where his detention would be logged and monitored, Morales took him directly to the basement overflow room. The space was approximately 8 by 10 feet, concrete walls, no windows, with a single overhead bulb and a locked steel door. Morales had repeatedly tampered with the evidence ledger and the quartermaster's key logs. Morales told other officers Carlos was being held pending investigation, but never entered him into the official detention log. No food or water was provided. The room had no toilet or sink. June temperatures in La Paz reached 65 degrees Fahrenheit during day, but the basement remained cold at night. Carlos's family reported him missing within 24 hours, but police claimed they had no record of his whereabouts. Within 48 hours of his detention, Carlos began showing marked dehydration symptoms, including intense thirst, dizziness, headache, decreased urine output, and confusion. His lips cracked, and his eyes had sunken deeply. Medical examiners later noted that the human body typically survives 3 to 5 days without water, depending on conditions, physical health, and ambient temperature. They concluded the cold basement environment accelerated Carlos's decline toward the lower end of that window. By the third day of his detention, Carlos could no longer stand. His kidneys were failing, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low. Officers saw him lay on the concrete floor, semi-conscious, with his skin dry and parchment-like, mucous membranes shriveled, and saliva crusted at the corners of his mouth. They said that he tried licking the floor and using his shirt to collect moisture. On June 22nd, 4 days after his detention began, a junior officer discovered him during a scheduled routine evidence audit. Carlos was unresponsive, his body positioned near the door where he had apparently tried to call for help. The officer immediately radioed for emergency medical assistance. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes and pronounced death at the scene after assessment. The autopsy listed acute dehydration and hypovolemic shock as the cause of death, noting hemoconcentration, high serum sodium, and acute kidney damage. Investigators later discovered the basement corridor camera had a 2-day gap logged as maintenance, and the evidence ledger contained several post-dated entries. Morales had exclusive access to the overflow locker that witnesses later described, seeing him use alone. Officer Morales was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter and human rights violations. He was later convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, with the court citing deliberate unlawful detention, deprivation of basic care, and retaliatory motive. Several senior officers were suspended and later dismissed following the investigation. It was April 22, 2017, at a small community college in Mesa, Arizona. Evening classes had ended, and the indoor pool facility was moving into its normal closing period. Lights remained on, but most students had already left the building. Lila Moreno, 19, was a second-year student and a member of the college swim team. She was not a standout athlete and was not well known on campus. Teammates described her as consistent and quiet, someone who followed routines and focused on training. Earlier that semester, Lila had been selected for a limited paid training slot that allowed extended access to the pool after regular hours. Another swimmer on the team, Maya Cruz, 20, had competed for the same position and did not receive it. Teammates later said the two avoided each other during practice. No formal complaints were filed, and no arguments were reported to coaches. On the night of April 22nd, several swimmers stayed after scheduled practice to complete extra laps. Two teammates later told investigators they saw Lila and Maya speaking briefly near the pool deck. The exchange appeared calm and routine. One swimmer recalled Maya suggesting that Lila finish a short solo swim before closing, something that was common during training season. By around 9:30 p.m., most swimmers had left the building. A janitor was cleaning nearby hallways, and locker room staff were finishing closing tasks. Witnesses stated that Lila remained behind and entered the pool alone to swim in the deep end. There were no lifeguards on duty, which was standard for optional after-hours training. Maya stayed on the deck for a short time, then walked toward the side exit near the pool control area. Access records later showed she passed through that area shortly before leaving the building. The pool was equipped with a motorized cover that was routinely used at closing. According to maintenance staff, the cover was normally activated only after swimmers had exited the water. There were no announcements or warnings indicating the cover would be engaged early that night. While Lila was swimming, The pool cover was activated and moved across the surface of the water. From outside the pool, the area appeared closed for the night. With the cover in place, the water surface was no longer visible from the deck or hallway windows. Several minutes passed before a student walking through the building stopped at the windows and noticed an unusual outline beneath the pool cover that should not have been there. The student alerted staff. When the cover was reopened, Lila was found unresponsive in the water below. 2 swimmers and the janitor later confirmed that Lila had been alone in the pool and that Maya was the last teammate seen near the deck and control area. Facility records showed the pool cover had been activated earlier than standard procedure. Investigators reviewed access logs, witness timelines, and messages documenting prior conflict related to team positions and personal disputes. Based on those findings, Maya Cruz was later charged in connection with Lila Moreno's death. The swim program was suspended the following year, and after-hours pool access was restricted. Lila Moreno's death was later cited internally as a case where routine procedures, trust, and deliberate action combined with fatal consequences. It was November 3, 2015, when Jordan Whitaker's arrogant disregard for patient safety finally caught up with him. The 45-year-old cardiac surgeon had built his reputation on performing unnecessary operations for profit, but his greed would lead to his own death. Jordan possessed an ego that matched his surgical skills, viewing patients as sources of income rather than human beings. His arrogant personality made him believe he was untouchable. He routinely ignored proper procedures and took dangerous shortcuts to maximize profits. 6 months earlier, Jordan had performed a completely unnecessary cardiac procedure on Robert Anderson, a 62-year-old retired teacher who came in for routine chest pain. Despite clear evidence that medication would resolve the issue, Jordan convinced the family that immediate surgery was required. During the operation, Jordan's reckless techniques led to massive complications. Robert suffered a stroke on the operating table due to Jordan's negligent surgical methods. When Robert died 3 days later, Jordan falsified medical records to blame pre-existing conditions. Gina Anderson, Robert's 38-year-old daughter and a surgical nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, knew her father had been healthy before Jordan's unnecessary surgery. She had worked alongside Jordan for years, witnessing his dangerous practices. Her father's death transformed her grief into calculated desire for justice. Working in the same hospital gave Gina intimate knowledge of surgical procedures, medication protocols, and Jordan's personal habits. She discovered that Jordan scheduled his own routine medical procedures during off hours to avoid scrutiny from colleagues. Jordan had scheduled a private gallbladder surgery for himself, using his influence to demand it be done late at night when the hospital was nearly empty. He didn't want colleagues gossiping about his health, and his arrogance made him believe he could bend rules without consequence. At 10 p.m., he arrived for the operation, trusting Gina to prepare his anesthesia while the skeleton night crew handled other emergencies. His supreme arrogance prevented him from suspecting that the nurse whose father he had killed might seek revenge. Gina had spent months planning the perfect murder. She replaced Jordan's standard anesthesia with a lethal combination of potassium chloride and succinylcholine. The potassium would stop his heart, while the paralytic agent would prevent him from calling for help. As Jordan lay on the operating table, the anesthesiologist injected what he believed was routine pre-operative sedation. But Gina had already swapped the medication, replacing it with the lethal mix. The potassium chloride immediately began disrupting Jordan's cardiac rhythm, while the succinylcholine paralyzed his respiratory muscles, leaving him unable to breathe or call for help. Within 90 seconds, Jordan experienced complete cardiac arrest, but remained fully conscious due to the paralytic agent preventing him from speaking or moving. His brain continued functioning for approximately 4 minutes while his body was completely paralyzed. He experienced the absolute terror of conscious death, unable to move, speak, or breathe as his organs systematically shut down. His eyes remained open and aware until his brain succumbed to oxygen deprivation. Jordan, who had caused so many unnecessary deaths through his surgical arrogance, died experiencing the same helplessness his victims had felt. His body was discovered by the night shift supervisor 20 minutes later. Gina disposed of the evidence and reported finding Jordan's body during routine checks. The death was initially attributed to sudden cardiac arrest from work-related stress. However, routine toxicology reports eventually revealed the modified anesthesia cocktail. The investigation uncovered Gina's access to restricted medications and her motive. Security footage ultimately led to her arrest for premeditated murder. It was September 22, 2015. A public hiking overlook in Northern California traced the edge of a rugged cliff above the valley below. Clear skies and light winds had drawn photographers to the site throughout the afternoon. A low, thigh-high safety barrier marked the edge, serving as a visual boundary rather than a physical restraint. Beyond it, the terrain dropped roughly 140 feet to a rocky base. Garrick Jope, 41, arrived early to set up his drone. He was an experienced aerial photographer who regularly worked near cliff edges to capture footage others avoided. Friends described him as meticulous with his equipment and openly dismissive of people he viewed as careless or incompetent. Weeks earlier, a business deal had collapsed after Garrick publicly criticized his partner, Miles Reardon, for mismanagement. The fallout was visible and personal. Reardon, 38, took the humiliation badly. Text messages sent in the following weeks showed escalating hostility. In several of them, he warned Garrick that he would be made to panic and that he would regret embarrassing the wrong person. The messages stopped days before the incident. That afternoon, Reardon arrived at the overlook separately, carrying a small handheld air horn. Park staff were not stationed in that section, and only a handful of tourists were scattered along the trail. Investigators later determined Reardon had chosen the overlook deliberately, aware that the low barrier and exposed drop made sudden loss of balance near the edge, likely to result in serious injury or death. Garrick stood near the barrier, leaning forward as he adjusted the drone controller. The aircraft hovered steadily above the valley, recording uninterrupted footage. His attention remained fixed on the live feed. Reardon approached from behind, moving quietly along the curved path. He stopped several feet away, raised the air horn, and waited until Garrick leaned further over the barrier. The air horn sounded directly behind him. Garrick recoiled violently. His body jerked backward, then forward as he tried to regain balance. His center of gravity was already over the edge. One foot caught against the base of the barrier as he twisted. Momentum carried his torso into the rail, and his weight tipped past it. The drone footage captured the fall from above. Garrick struck a rocky ledge partway down, then continued falling until his body impacted the base of the cliff. Tourists farther along the trail heard the air horn, but did not witness the fall. Reardon left the area within minutes. The overlook's curved layout shielded the cliff edge from casual view, and no one immediately noticed what had happened. Nearly an hour later, another hiker saw the abandoned drone controller near the barrier and looked over the edge. Emergency services were contacted, but the terrain delayed access. A recovery team reached Garrick several hours later and pronounced him dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from a significant height. The drone later descended automatically and was recovered near the base of the cliff. Investigators reviewed its footage, which clearly showed Reardon approaching with the air horn and Garrick's reaction. Purchase records tied the device to Reardon, and prior threatening messages were recovered. During questioning, Reardon admitted to activating the air horn but claimed he had not intended Garrick to fall. Authorities determined the act was reckless, retaliatory, and carried a foreseeable risk of fatal harm. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in California State Prison. The drone footage served as primary evidence. The case closed 8 months later. It was May 2015 in a quiet Utah suburb, where houses lined a narrow cul-de-sac. The Whitakers lived on one side, the Clarks on the other. The driveways met in the center, separated only by a strip of shared concrete poured years before either family moved in. For months, small arguments about parking and boundaries had built into daily tension. 41-year-old John Whitaker worked construction and often parked his pickup close to the line. Across from him, Tom and Melissa Clark owned a large SUV that barely fit in their drive. Neighbors later said the problem started when Tom accidentally grazed John's truck while backing out. The scratch was small, but John treated it as deliberate. The two men argued in the street while Melissa tried to calm them down. After that day, the families barely spoke. John installed a small camera facing his driveway, and the Clarks put up a motion light. Every time one vehicle idled too long near the dividing strip, the other household took notice. On the evening of June 12th, witnesses saw John outside near dusk, pacing along the driveway and muttering about teaching the neighbors a lesson. Around 9 p.m., he carried out a 5-gallon jug of motor oil and poured it in a thin layer across the center section of concrete where the two driveways met. He later told investigators he only wanted to make the surface slippery so the Clarks would stop parking close to his truck. A light rain began just after 10 p.m., coating the neighborhood in a thin mist. The mixture of oil and water created a slick sheen that ran several feet down the incline toward the street. Around 10:40, Melissa returned from her late shift at the grocery store. Security footage from a nearby house showed her SUV's headlights turning into the cul-de-sac and backing toward the driveway. As she reversed up the incline, the tires hit the oiled patch and lost traction. The vehicle rolled backward faster than she could correct. Across the street, a neighbor on his porch saw the tail lights jerk upward as the rear end struck the retaining wall at the edge of the yard. He heard glass break, followed by a dull thud. John ran out of his house seconds later, shouting her name. He tried to open the driver's side door but slipped on the wet pavement. When police and paramedics arrived, they found the rear of the SUV crushed against the concrete lip. Melissa was still inside, unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene from blunt force injuries. Investigators noticed the heavy oil residue that still floated on the puddles along the driveway. They collected samples and later matched them to the same brand stored in John's garage. His fingerprints were found on the plastic jug left behind near the trash bin. During questioning, John first claimed he spilled the oil accidentally, then admitted to pouring it intentionally, but insisted he didn't expect anyone to get hurt. The county prosecutor charged him with criminally negligent homicide and reckless endangerment. The case drew attention locally because of its simplicity, an ordinary neighborhood dispute that escalated without warning. He was found competent to stand trial after a brief evaluation and accepted a plea agreement rather than face a full jury trial. John pleaded guilty the following year and received a 10-year sentence. The house went up for sale soon after John's conviction. Tom Clark moved out of the neighborhood within months, saying he couldn't stand seeing the spot where the crash happened. New owners later repaved the entire driveway, covering the shared strip with fresh concrete. Longtime residents still point out the faint discoloration near the edge where oil once stained the surface, a small mark left from a grudge that turned fatal. It was November 11, 2013 in Laredo, Texas, inside a small auto repair shop along a border service road. Mild weather kept the bay doors open and radios playing as customers came and went. The evening felt routine, with nothing on the surface suggesting the strain that had been building behind the scenes. The tension focused on Miguel Santos, who was 40 and known as the guy the shop leaned on when work ran late. He stayed after hours, followed the rules, and handled repairs others didn't want. Outside the shop, he picked up overtime and coached youth soccer to support his infant twin daughters. That balance fell apart after he reported a co-worker, Daniel Jones, 38, for stealing tools and selling them off-site. Management confirmed the theft and issued a warning, and from then on, the atmosphere in the shop changed. The argument started soon after. Daniel accused Miguel of snitching and costing everyone money. Other mechanics overheard shouting near the tool cages and service bays. Managers tried to keep them on separate shifts, but short staffing meant they still crossed paths. Security cameras recorded several heated encounters in the weeks before the incident, including one where Daniel told Miguel he would regret it. On Veterans Day evening, Miguel stayed late to finish a suspension repair on a luxury SUV. Most of the staff had already left. Daniel remained on the clock in a nearby bay, assigned routine cleanup. Security cameras showed Miguel lifting the SUV and positioning himself underneath to secure the final bolts. The lift arms were correctly set, the safety locks engaged, and the vehicle was stable. At 8:56 p.m., Daniel walked into Miguel's bay without speaking. Miguel continued working beneath the vehicle, focused on the suspension. Daniel stood near the control column for several seconds, watching. Then, without any exchange or warning, he reached out, pulled the safety lock release, and held the hydraulic control down. The lift dropped immediately. With the safety locks released, the SUV dropped several feet. Miguel screamed as the chassis slammed onto his chest and shoulders. The impact crushed his rib cage inward, forced the air from his lungs, and pinned him to the concrete. Blood spread beneath his body as his legs kicked and scraped against the floor, then slowed. Daniel stepped back, froze for a moment, then turned and ran out of frame. The vehicle continued to settle unevenly, fully trapping Miguel beneath it. His arms were pinned, his head pressed sideways against the concrete. His mouth opened and closed as his chest failed to rise. His legs twitched briefly, then went still as all movement stopped. At 9:18 p.m., a passerby noticed blood pooling under the bay door and called 911. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later and found Miguel unresponsive, chest compressed beneath the SUV. Additional lifting equipment was required to raise the vehicle. Miguel went into cardiac arrest during extrication and was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as crush asphyxia due to massive chest compression, which collapsed both lungs and prevented oxygen from reaching the heart. Investigators reviewed the footage and confirmed the lever had been intentionally engaged while Miguel was underneath the vehicle. Daniel Jones was arrested and charged with murder, a first-degree felony. He was later convicted and sentenced to 60 years in state prison. The shop closed within 6 months amid criminal proceedings and civil lawsuits. Miguel's twin daughters were raised with the help of extended family. It was June 18, 2016 in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, at a mountain zipline park during peak summer hours. The air was warm. Lines extended beyond the shaded platforms. Guides called out group numbers. Harnesses clinked against metal rails, and phones were raised as visitors waited, filmed, and talked over the constant hum of activity. Lena Whitaker was 22 years old, a college student from Kentucky visiting Pigeon Forge with 3 friends after finishing summer classes. She worked part-time at a campus bookstore and paid for short trips by taking extra weekend shifts. She had no background in extreme sports and wasn't filming for social media. The group chose the zipline park because it was nearby, affordable, and advertised as beginner-friendly. What most visitors didn't know was that Lena had a prior connection to one of the park's seasonal employees. Derek Hall, 29, worked on the zipline crew that summer, handling gear staging and harness rotation between groups. Years earlier, Derek and Lena attended the same high school. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that Lena had been part of a group that repeatedly mocked and humiliated him during that time. The encounters were not physical, but persistent. Former classmates described Derek as withdrawn afterward, while Lena moved on without consequences. The park operated multiple zipline runs across a wooded slope above a rocky ravine. Riders wore full-body harnesses clipped to a cable trolley, and guides followed a fixed routine, selecting a harness, tightening straps, performing a brief visual and tug check, then signaling the launch. During peak hours, equipment was cycled rapidly with little idle time. That afternoon, staff logs and security footage showed Derek Hall lingering near the equipment rack, despite not being assigned to that station. Cameras recorded him removing a spare harness, turning it inward, and handling the waist assembly out of view before returning it to the rack. About 10 minutes later, Lena's group reached the front. A guide selected the compromised harness, placed it on Lena, tightened the straps, and clipped her into the line. From bystander phone footage, the checks appear routine. Hands-on webbing, quick tug, then clearance to launch. No visible issue was apparent. Lena stepped off the platform and rolled smoothly onto the cable. Security footage showed her traveling normally across the first span, legs bent, posture stable. She crossed above the open air toward the center of the ravine. Mid-line, as Lena reached the lowest point of the cable span, the trolley jolted slightly, causing a sudden spike in force that tore the already compromised strap completely. Security footage shows her body drop abruptly. The bystander's phone captured cheering breaking into shouting as she fell from the line. She struck rock and compacted soil approximately 70 feet below. Operations halted immediately as staff cleared the remaining riders from the platforms and contacted emergency services. The county medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force trauma resulting from a fall from height. Inspection of the harness confirmed deliberate sabotage. Investigators determined that a primary load-bearing belay loop had been deliberately cut to the point of structural failure, consistent with the use of a blade rather than material fatigue or a manufacturing defect. Security footage from behind the staging platform showed Derek Hall handling the same spare harness minutes before it was issued, despite not being assigned to that station. Staff logs and supervisor statements confirmed he had unsupervised access to the equipment rack during that window. Hall was arrested later that evening and formally charged with first-degree murder and tampering with safety equipment. During a recorded interview, he admitted to sabotaging the harness and told investigators the act was motivated by long-standing resentment, tied to repeated humiliation he experienced during high school. He was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Authorities classified the death as a targeted homicide carried out using his workplace access. The park permanently closed the affected zip line, removed spare harnesses from public access, and revised equipment handling protocols. Investigators described the incident as rare and isolated. It was February 12, 2018. The winter air in Helsinki, Finland was typical for the season, hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside a downtown fitness center, Mikko Line, a 33-year-old gym supervisor, arrived for his evening shift unaware that a workplace conflict he'd dismissed would escalate into his final hours. Mikko had worked in fitness management for 9 years, climbing from personal trainer to supervisor at one of Helsinki's mid-tier gym chains. He was known for his rigid management style and zero-tolerance approach to maintenance violations. Friends described him as efficient but abrasive, someone who prioritized protocols over people. His personnel file showed multiple complaints about his confrontational methods, particularly toward junior staff. 2 weeks earlier, he'd formally reprimanded Jari Koskinen, a 28-year-old maintenance worker, for leaving cleaning supplies unsecured, threatening termination for future violations. Co-workers later told investigators that Jari became openly resentful afterward, repeatedly stating Mikko had ruined his job and would pay for it. The reprimand was logged in the facility's internal incident system and acknowledged electronically by Jari. The Finnish sauna ran between 160 and 180 degrees Fahrenheit, controlled by decade-old electric heaters with a manual panel in the maintenance corridor. Staff were required to monitor use and ventilation, but records showed the high-temperature cutoff had been flagged as unreliable that month. The wooden door had been improperly fitted with a non-standard maintenance restraint, a temporary service bar not intended for occupied use, creating a severe safety hazard if misused. That evening, Jari approached Mikko at 6:45 in the afternoon, claiming the sauna needed immediate deep cleaning before peak hours. Mikko agreed to inspect the space first, entering the 8-by-10-foot chamber while Jari gathered supplies. The ventilation vent inside the sauna had been partially blocked due to ongoing cleaning preparations, reducing airflow. The facility's incident report later confirmed that Jari deliberately locked the door's exterior bolt once Mikko was inside, then remained briefly in the maintenance corridor, adjusting the heater controls before leaving the area entirely, despite knowing the sauna was occupied. Mikko initially didn't notice the locked door, assuming Jari would return momentarily. By 7:05 in the afternoon, the temperature had climbed past 190 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond safe operating levels. Witness timelines later suggested Mikko attempted to exit multiple times as the heat intensified, discovering the door wouldn't budge. He pounded on the thick wooden door, but the sauna's dense wood construction and continuous ambient noise from the gym's sound system masked any noise. The facility's CCTV footage, installed only in public hallways under company privacy policy, captured Mikko's hand briefly appearing in the door's small window before disappearing. At approximately 7:20 in the afternoon, Mikko collapsed forward onto the wooden bench, The extreme heat had caused severe dehydration and disorientation within minutes, his core body temperature rising rapidly. His body temperature reached critical levels, triggering organ stress and cardiac irregularities. The compromised ventilation and sustained heater output prevented meaningful cooling, accelerating his physical deterioration. He remained motionless on the bench as the temperature stabilized around 195 degrees Fahrenheit due to the heater continuing to cycle without an effective cutoff. A gym member attempting to use the sauna at 8:30 in the afternoon noticed the locked door and unusual heat radiating through the wood. After failing to open it, she alerted the front desk staff. Front desk logs later confirmed no scheduled maintenance was authorized at that hour. Employees forced the door open at 8:42 in the afternoon, discovering Miko unconscious and unresponsive. Emergency services arrived within 9 minutes, but paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The autopsy determined Miko died from fatal hyperthermia, complicated by severe dehydration, cardiovascular collapse, and heat stroke-induced heart arrhythmia. The CCTV footage became crucial evidence, showing Hari locking the door and being present near the heater control area shortly before the temperature spike, with timestamps matching maintenance logs and front desk records. Digital footage metadata was preserved by investigators to maintain chain of custody. Police arrested him 4 days later on homicide charges. He was later convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the court citing deliberate confinement, manipulation of the sauna's safety systems, and retaliatory motive. It was November 23, 2016, in Camden, New Jersey. Early winter temperatures had settled over the city as Elena Rodriguez finished cleaning offices in a downtown building late into the evening. Elena, 34, was a single mother working multiple jobs to support her daughter, Sophia. Financial records later showed her income was stretched thin by medical expenses after Sophia was diagnosed with leukemia the year before. When her insurance failed to cover treatment costs, Elena turned to Anthony Castellano, 45, a local lender operating outside state licensing requirements. Castellano's loans carried interest rates far above legal limits, with penalties that compounded weekly. Payment records showed that despite consistent deposits from Elena, the balance increased steadily. Police later documented multiple complaints against Castellano from borrowers who described intimidation tactics, including unannounced visits to homes and workplaces. In Elena's case, school administrators later confirmed Castellano appeared near Sophia's high school on more than one occasion. By the fall of 2016, Elena's debt exceeded $40,000. Phone records showed frequent contact initiated by Castellano, including late-night calls. Investigators later determined Elena began monitoring his movements after those encounters, learning that he regularly used an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city to meet clients and store paperwork. On the evening of November 23rd, Elena contacted Castellano and told him she had cash to settle part of the debt. Cell tower data placed both individuals at the warehouse later that night. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings showed Elena entering alone, carrying a baseball bat, and leaving the area approximately 20 minutes later. Inside the warehouse, evidence indicated a violent confrontation occurred near the loading area. Blood spatter analysis showed multiple impacts to Castellano's head. The autopsy later identified extensive skull fractures, subdural hemorrhaging, and severe brain swelling consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. The medical examiner concluded Castellano lost consciousness quickly and died at the scene from catastrophic cranial injuries. Elena did not call for help. Investigators later recovered the baseball bat from a nearby dumpster, where it bore her fingerprints and Castellano's DNA. Castellano's body was discovered the following morning by a maintenance worker conducting a routine inspection. During the investigation, detectives uncovered Castellano's illegal lending operation and a documented pattern of harassment involving multiple victims. However, evidence also established that Elena had planned the encounter, brought a weapon, and lured Castellano to a private location under false pretenses. Elena was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. At trial, testimony from other borrowers provided context for Castellanos' conduct, but prosecutors argued the killing was an act of deliberate retaliation rather than self-defense. The jury agreed, citing premeditation and the use of a weapon. Elena was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in state prison. Authorities later shut down Castellanos' lending operation, and several civil cases followed. Sofia was placed with relatives. The warehouse was demolished 2 years later as part of a redevelopment project. Investigators concluded the case illustrated how prolonged exploitation and personal retaliation combined to produce a fatal outcome that neither side survived. It was November 2014 in Alberta, Canada. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thin ice lined the edges of Highway 22 between Turner Valley and Black Diamond. Constable Ryan Burke, 33, had driven that route for 6 years. Locals knew his patrol car and often waved when he passed. He had a steady reputation, calm with drivers, more likely to issue warnings than tickets. His approach made him well-liked in the small towns spread along the foothills. 2 years earlier, Ryan had been part of a routine stop that ended badly. A wanted suspect resisted arrest, and the chase ended with a crash and a fatal gunfire exchange. Ryan hadn't fired the shot, but he'd been there when the man's brother was taken into custody. The case was closed and the report cleared him. Yet people who followed local news remembered his name. Over time, he went back to quiet patrols, checking speeders, helping with breakdowns, and watching for wildlife that crossed the road after dusk. On November 21st, a little after 9 p.m., the radio logged Ryan's call about a pickup with its hazard lights on near the old bridge curve. He told dispatch he'd check it out before heading back to the detachment. Dashcam footage, later reviewed by investigators, shows the moment his cruiser pulled behind the truck. The flashing lights of his bar reflected against the rear window of the pickup. Ryan stepped out, shining his flashlight toward the driver's side. The road was nearly empty, just distant headlights miles away. Seconds later, the dash cam captured a brief flare and a low popping sound, softer than a normal gunshot because of the wind. The picture jolted, then the camera tilted sideways as the unit hit the pavement. The lens kept recording from the ground, showing the pickup speeding away northbound. A traffic cone caught under its rear tire. A motorist traveling south saw the police lights flicker, then fade. He slowed and noticed the patrol car's door open with no one inside. When he called emergency dispatch, the operator confirmed that no units were expected at that location. Officers and paramedics reached the scene within minutes, finding Ryan near the shoulder beside the vehicle, his radio still clipped to his jacket. He was unresponsive and was taken to the nearest hospital in Black Diamond, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators confirmed he had been struck once in the upper chest at close range. Witnesses at 2 nearby gas stations later described a man who'd been asking questions that week about the officer who killed his brother. One attendant remembered him filling gas cans and driving a gray pickup with mismatched panels. The description matched the vehicle seen in the dashcam. The case remained open for several months, handled by regional and federal teams. Despite searches through nearby properties and vehicle records, the man seen at local gas stations was never found. The abandoned pickup was traced to a junkyard purchase under a false name. The patrol unit was later retired from service, and that section of Highway 22 was added to a list of high-risk stops for single-officer patrols. It was August 15th, 2018, when Renee Callister's childhood cruelty finally caught up with her. The 31-year-old marketing executive had built a successful career, but her polished exterior concealed the heart of a vicious bully who had never faced consequences for the psychological torture she inflicted on vulnerable children. Renee possessed a narcissistic personality that made her incapable of genuine empathy. Even as an adult, she viewed others as objects for her entertainment, dismissing the pain she caused with casual indifference. Her social media showcased a perfect life, filled with luxury vacations and designer clothes, funded by her ruthless corporate tactics. 20 years earlier, at Camp Wildwood, Renee had been the ringleader of systematic abuse against Jordan Whitaker. The shy 12-year-old became her favorite target, enduring daily humiliation that included being forced to eat garbage, having his belongings destroyed, and being locked in storage closets for hours. Renee's cruelty drove Jordan to write a suicide note. though he never followed through. Jordan Whitaker, now 33, had spent decades in therapy recovering from the trauma Renee inflicted. The former victim worked as a property caretaker for the county, which gave him access to the abandoned Camp Wildwood. While Renee thrived in her corporate world, Jordan struggled with depression and anxiety that stemmed directly from her childhood torture. The camp had been closed for 15 years, its buildings slowly rotting in the wilderness. Jordan maintained the property, walking daily through the locations where his innocence had been destroyed. He kept his childhood suicide note as a reminder of how close Renee had pushed him to the edge. Renee's Instagram posts revealed her plan to visit the old camp for a nostalgic photo shoot. She wanted to recreate childhood memories for her lifestyle blog, completely oblivious to the pain those memories represented. Jordan saw this as divine justice finally presenting itself after 2 decades of waiting. On that August afternoon, Renee arrived alone at 2 p.m., her expensive camera equipment contrasting sharply with the decaying surroundings. She posed cheerfully in locations where she had once tormented children, treating the abandoned camp like a backdrop for social media content. Jordan emerged from the old dining hall, carrying his childhood suicide note. When he confronted her with the evidence of what her cruelty had nearly caused, Renee's reaction was everything Jordan expected. She laughed, dismissing their childhood interactions as harmless fun while showing zero remorse. Her complete lack of remorse triggered something primal in Jordan. 20 years of suppressed rage exploded as he chased her through the rotting camp buildings toward the old rope course, where she had once pushed him off platforms and cut his safety ropes for entertainment. Renee became entangled in deteriorated rope obstacles 30 feet above the ground. The equipment was now a death trap of frayed cables and rotting wood. Jordan stood below, watching as Renee begged for help, while he recited every cruel thing she had done to him and other vulnerable children. The rope finally snapped. Renee plummeted 30 feet onto broken wooden posts that had once supported camp signs. One pierced through her abdomen while another fractured her spine, paralyzing her instantly. She remained conscious for only minutes, experiencing a brief but intense moment of helplessness she had once inflicted on others, before succumbing to massive blood loss. Jordan left her body at the camp and reported finding her the next day during his routine inspection. The investigation initially supported accidental death, but Jordan's connection to Renee eventually led to his arrest for murder. It was December 9, 2015, at a middle school in Carmel, Indiana. After 4:30 p.m., the building had mostly emptied, leaving only a few staff members finishing end-of-semester tasks, while hallway cameras continued recording every entry and exit for later review. Among the remaining teachers was Harold Harlan, 44, who had spent 14 years teaching 7th grade American history. His classroom was known for rigid discipline and public shaming. He routinely read failing grades aloud, assigned detention for minor behavior, and kept detailed records that parents later described as humiliating. Multiple complaints were filed, but internal reviews found no policy violations, as district anti-bullying rules applied only to students, not teachers. Detention took place in room 127, a former storage room off the main hallway. The space had no windows, a single inward opening door, and relied entirely on the building's central ventilation. It held a few desks, a teacher's table, and metal cabinets occasionally used to store custodial supplies. Policy required the supervising teacher to stay inside with the student, leaving both alone in an enclosed room with little oversight. That afternoon, Harlan assigned detention to Zayden Webb, a 13-year-old student who had received repeated detention since the start of the school year. Webb had been singled out frequently in class, mocked for poor scores, and once kept after school for nearly an hour longer than required, according to later statements from classmates. Security footage showed Webb entering room 127 at 3:45 p.m. and leaving at 4:15 p.m. after signing out. Later footage showed Harlan entering the room at 4:18 p.m. and never exiting. What investigators later uncovered filled in what the cameras could not. Earlier that week, Webb had accessed a custodial supply area and removed a bottle of muriatic acid used for restroom cleaning. During detention, He poured the chemical into an open container inside room 127 and damaged the door handle mechanism using a small tool from his backpack. He then sealed the container inside a cabinet and left the room, knowing Harlan often stayed behind to work alone. At 4:18 p.m., Harlan re-entered the room with papers and a laptop. As the room sat closed, hydrochloric acid vapors slowly filled the space. With no windows and limited airflow, the fumes intensified. Harlan began coughing and experienced rapid throat and lung irritation. As he tried to escape, the damaged door hardware failed. Scratch marks later found on the door, and walls showed repeated attempts to force it open. The acid burned his face, neck, and hands as he struggled to breathe. He collapsed beside his desk as oxygen deprivation worsened. At 5:47 p.m., custodian James Torres noticed a sharp chemical odor in the hallway and traced it to room 127. Inside, he found Harlan unresponsive and immediately called emergency services as hallway cameras continued recording the first responders entering the room. Responders arrived minutes later but were unable to revive him. The medical examiner ruled the death an acute respiratory failure caused by prolonged exposure to hydrochloric acid vapors with severe internal and external chemical burns. Investigators later determined the act was deliberate. Webb admitted he wanted Harlan to feel trapped, citing months of public humiliation and fear. He was adjudicated delinquent for an act equivalent to murder and sentenced to confinement in a state juvenile facility until age 21. The school permanently closed room 127, revised detention policies to require multiple staff, and removed chemical storage from instructional areas. It was February 18, 2017, in Riverside, California, on a Saturday evening at a neighborhood recreation center. The gym was crowded for a weekly pickup basketball league. Shoes squeaked across the court. The scoreboard buzzed between possessions and phones were propped against bleachers to record highlights. From the outside, it was just another competitive game. Marcus Lee was 27 years old and worked as a delivery supervisor for a regional logistics company. He played basketball 3 nights a week and treated pickup games like organized competition. Teammates described him as aggressive on defense and physical under the rim. He used his body often, boxing out hard, setting moving screens and throwing elbows when fighting for position. Complaints had been made before, but games usually continued. Jason Morales, 26, worked as a junior electrician and had played against Marcus for over a year. They knew each other by name. Their matchups were tense. During several games, Marcus had bumped Jason mid-air or driven his shoulder into him while cutting to the basket. 2 weeks earlier, during a rebound scramble, Marcus's elbow caught Jason above the eye. Gym CCTV recorded Jason leaving the court bleeding from a cut eyebrow that later required stitches. Witnesses said Marcus waved it off as accidental. On the night of the incident, both men were on opposing teams. The game was fast and close. Jason guarded Marcus tightly, avoiding contact early. Marcus continued playing physically, backing into defenders and using his arms to create space. At one point, Jason complained to teammates that Marcus was continuing the same physical behavior from previous games. No official referees were present, only a scorekeeper. Midway through the second half, CCTV above the backboard shows Marcus driving on a fast break. Jason trails him closely. As Marcus jumps for a dunk, Jason closes in and forcefully extends both hands into Marcus's lower back while he's airborne. The push shifts Marcus forward mid-jump. He misses the rim and his head snaps back, striking an unpadded metal support arm behind the backboard, part of an older hoop assembly. The impact is loud and sharp. Marcus drops straight down onto the court. A phone video from the bleachers captures players stopping and shouting as blood begins pooling near his head. Jason steps back toward the baseline as others wave for help. The gym calls 911 at 8:42 p.m. Paramedics arrive within minutes and attempt stabilization on the court. Marcus shows no meaningful response and is transported to a nearby hospital, where he is pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as traumatic brain injury caused by a high-force impact with a fixed metal structure. Police reviewed Jim's CCTV and phone videos, confirming Jason's hands extended into Marcus while he was airborne. Witnesses described ongoing tension between the two men, including a prior elbow injury captured on earlier footage. Messages recovered from Jason's phone referenced resentment over Marcus's physical style of play. Jason Morales was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter. He was later convicted and sentenced to 11 years in California State Prison, with the court citing the retaliatory nature of the shove and the extreme risk created by pushing an airborne player toward a fixed metal structure. The Recreation Center suspended pickup basketball leagues, upgraded hoop padding to cover exposed support arms, and revised safety policies to limit physical contact during unsupervised games. It was July 2018 in Clearwater, Florida, when the city pool opened for its busiest week of summer. Temperatures stayed near 90, and the water was crowded from morning until dusk. Two of the seasonal lifeguards, 23-year-old Ryan Geller and 22-year-old Derek Mills, had worked together since May. Both were certified instructors, quick swimmers, and known for pushing each other during training. The competition started harmlessly. Who could climb the ladder faster, who cleared the diving boards first, but soon turned personal. Supervisors noticed they timed every drill down to the second. During a mid-July rescue simulation, Ryan outperformed Derek by almost 4 seconds. The staff clapped, and one of the senior guards joked that Derek should stick to sunscreen duty. Witnesses later said Derek laughed it off, but his mood changed afterward. He started showing up early and staying late, cleaning gear and checking equipment on his own. Small arguments broke out between the two about whose rotation zone was more difficult. The final staff evaluation was set for July 21st. The city planned to promote one seasonal lifeguard to full-time for the fall swim programs. Derek knew the decision would come down to their performance in the timed rescue test. That evening, after closing, he lingered near the diving area. Surveillance later showed him kneeling beside the lifeguard lane with a bottle of oil-based sunscreen, rubbing some onto his arms, then spreading the rest across the wet deck near the rescue line. He wiped it once with a towel, leaving a slick, nearly invisible layer that blended with the water already on the tiles. The next morning, the staff gathered for drills before the pool opened. The deck was humid and slippery as usual from the early cleaning cycle. Ryan stood at his station near the deep end, waiting for the whistle that signaled the start of his timed run. Derek took the next lane over, watching. At 7:40 a.m., the supervisor blew the whistle and called a mock rescue from the diving area. Ryan sprinted forward, as he always did, crossing the same stretch of deck he used in every practice. Halfway across, his right foot slid sideways. Witnesses said his arms flailed once before he fell backward, striking the pool edge behind him. The sound echoed across the water, followed by the splash of his body sliding into the deep end. 2 guards dove in immediately, pulling him to the surface within seconds. He was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital from a severe head injury. Investigators found traces of sunscreen mixed with pool water on the deck, and later recovered the nearly empty bottle from the trash bin behind the lifeguard stand. Derek's fingerprints were identified on the cap. During questioning, he admitted spreading it as a prank and said he only wanted to make the deck extra slippery for a laugh. He was charged with manslaughter and reckless endangerment. The pool reopened weeks later with new safety flooring and a permanent sign warning staff to keep the deck dry at all times. It was August 14th, 2016, outside Kingman, Arizona. The desert heat lingered into the night as a small group of motorcycle riders gathered along a rural stretch of highway they had used for years. The road was isolated, flat, and rarely patrolled, making it a popular spot for informal but organized races among locals. Tyler Grant, 24, was one of the regulars. He was not well known outside the group and had no online following. He worked at an auto parts store during the week and spent most weekends tuning his bike and racing with friends. The races were competitive. Riders timed their runs, compared speeds, and sometimes placed small bets. Everyone involved understood the risks, but the group trusted one another. Evan Miller, 25, had been racing alongside Tyler since high school. They rebuilt engines together and often rode in pairs. In recent months, however, the dynamic between them changed. Tyler had upgraded his motorcycle and began winning consistently. Evan started telling others that Tyler was cheating by pushing past what they had informally agreed was fair. No rules were written, and no one could prove anything. The group dismissed the complaints as frustration. Text messages later recovered by investigators showed Evan accusing Tyler of stealing wins and making him look bad. Tyler continued racing and did not respond publicly. On the night of August 14th, several riders met at their usual pull-off. Witnesses said Tyler mentioned doing a solo run down the road before the rest of the group arrived. Evan left shortly afterward, saying he was heading ahead to check the route. Investigators later determined that Evan drove farther down the road to a narrow section bordered by fixed structures on both sides. At some point, a steel cable was placed across the roadway at a height that would not be visible to an approaching rider at speed. There were no warning lights or markings. Minutes later, Tyler entered the stretch of road at high speed. The area was dark, and there was no time to react. He struck the cable and was thrown from his motorcycle. The injuries were catastrophic and fatal. Two riders who had started their own run shortly after Tyler heard the crash and arrived moments later. They found the motorcycle down, and the cable still stretched across the road. One rider called for help while another stayed with the scene. Investigators documented distinct cable impact marks and damage patterns on both the motorcycle and Tyler's body. Witness statements placed Evan ahead of Tyler on the route shortly before the crash. Tire tracks and tool marks were later matched to equipment found in Evan's vehicle. When questioned, Evan initially denied being on that stretch of road. Phone location data and witness timelines placed him there minutes before the crash, and tool marks on the cable matched equipment recovered from his vehicle. Evan Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the deliberate placement of a deadly obstruction. Prosecutors argued the act showed premeditation and was motivated by retaliation over perceived cheating. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The racing group disbanded after the conviction. Tyler Grant's death was officially ruled a homicide caused by a targeted act of revenge carried out by someone he considered a friend. It was April 17, 2018. A suburban home renovation site in Ohio sat quiet in the mid-morning. The weather was clear and dry, with temperatures in the low 60s. A two-story house was undergoing exterior work, with scaffolding and equipment scattered across the front yard. The neighborhood was residential and calm. A shared storage shed sat between two properties, accessible to multiple households. Macy Twine was 36 years old and worked as a freelance painter. She had built a reputation for quality work and attention to detail. Colleagues described her as professional and methodical, someone who followed safety protocols. She had been hired to paint the exterior of the home and had been on the job for 3 days. Macy lived next door to Caleb Rourke, who had grown increasingly hostile toward her over the past several months. The tension began after she filed multiple noise complaints with local authorities regarding late-night disturbances from his property. The complaints had resulted in warnings and fines. He had sent her messages in response, including one that warned her to watch her step. The shared shed between their properties housed tools and equipment for both households. Macy stored her fiberglass extension ladder there, along with other painting supplies. Caleb had access to the same shed. That morning, Macy retrieved her ladder from the shed to continue work on the upper sections of the house. The ladder was a standard extension model, approximately 20 feet when fully extended. It relied on locking pins to secure the upper section in place. A doorbell camera from across the street had captured Caleb entering the shed earlier that morning. Macy positioned the ladder against the house siding on firm, level ground. She extended it fully and checked the base for stability. She climbed slowly, carrying a paint tray and brush. As she reached approximately 14 feet, one of the upper locking pins gave way. The pin had been partially backed out and weakened, allowing the connection to fail under load. The extension section collapsed downward. Macy lost her grip and fell backward, striking the concrete driveway below. She landed on her back with her head and neck taking the primary impact. She did not move after hitting the ground. A neighbor who had been retrieving mail saw the fall and immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Macy was unresponsive and showed no signs of breathing. They pronounced her dead at the scene. The cause of death was severe head and neck trauma, consistent with a fall from height. Investigators examined the ladder and found that one locking pin had been partially backed out and weakened, allowing collapse under load. The mechanism showed signs of tampering, with tool marks visible on the metal components. Authorities reviewed footage from the doorbell camera. The recording showed Caleb entering the shed approximately 30 minutes before Macy arrived. Investigators also recovered the threatening messages he had sent. During questioning, Caleb denied tampering with the ladder, but could not explain his presence in the shed that morning. Tool marks on the ladder matched a wrench found in his garage. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter under Ohio law. Prosecutors argued that his actions were deliberate and motivated by retaliation for the noise complaints. The evidence included the tampered ladder, doorbell footage, threatening messages, and forensic analysis. The trial concluded with a conviction. The court determined that the tampering was intentional and that he had knowingly created a life-threatening situation. Macy's death was ruled a direct result of his actions. Caleb Rourke was sentenced to 8 years in Ohio State Prison. The court cited deliberate equipment tampering as an aggravating factor. The case closed 11 months after the incident.